All right, folks, it's 25 after the hour, so we're going to get started with our fourth installment today. My name is Ray Daniel. If this is your first session, responsible for the integration portfolio here in the Americas. We have with us today a couple of our top folks out of Hersley, Anthony Beardsmore and Matt Lemming, and they're going to take us through what's new in 9.4. After this, we will have office hours, so don't go running away. We'll do office hours where that gives you the opportunity to ask questions in a real time kind of mode, and so that should be a good one. So I think that's about it. So I'm going to get out of the way. Matt, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. So good afternoon, good morning to whichever bit of the world you're in. So my name's Matt Lemming, and I'm the architect for MQ for z/OS. So worrying about all of the mainframe aspects of MQ, and I'm going to be talking with Ant about what's new in MQ 9.4. So we're going to give a general update, highlighting on some of the most important bits, and then there'll be further on sessions in the rest of the week, kind of going even deeper. But before we get into the main content, it's over to Ant.
Thanks, Matt. Yes, so as Matt just said, we'll be giving you an update today. I'm Anthony Beardsmore. I'm development architect for a lot of the bits and pieces that don't live with Matt on the mainframe. So the distributed queue manager, core runtime, clustering, various security components. Yeah, so the important thing is that all the really difficult questions that come up today ought to be held until the deep dive sessions later in the week. We'll just take the easy ones if that's all right, but please do ask away on the chat channel.
Yeah, good point. I forgot to mention that. Okay, so before we get into the meat of the slides, I just wanted to bring this one up. For those of you who were on the earlier session with Kim and Martin, where they were talking about how a mature software product is much more than just functional completeness. There's lots of different aspects. Then you would have seen this slide, and in particular this triangle, which they talked through in depth. So as you see, when we go through the slides, we're kind of going to be having this triangle just on the lead in, just sort of highlighting the particular aspect we're talking about. So that's why there's sort of triangles with red distributed throughout this presentation. So moving on, so obviously this presentation is all about what's new, and we're going to major on what's in the 9.4 LTS release, which came out sort of the middle of last year. In terms of what's going on in the lab, we as soon as a LTS release comes out, we just carry on going, working on new function, which we then release in subsequent continuous delivery releases. So most of the content here is about what's in 9.4 LTS, but we'll also cover, where relevant, content in 9.4.1 CD, which was sort of November time, and then 9.4.2 CD, which is our most recent continuous delivery release, which came out in the middle of February. And what we're seeing at the moment is that customers are starting to move to 9.4. We're definitely getting more and more conversations about, I'm about to move, what new function should I be taking advantage of, what new function should I be aware of, and that's really the purpose of this presentation, just to remind you, because you've probably heard us talk about this sort of content or some of this content before, maybe last year or maybe in other venues, but it's just kind of highlighting the new function so you're aware of what's there as soon as you move to 9.4 and take advantage of it. Okay, so this slide is definitely a little bit of an eye chart, and each box is basically one of the bits of new function we've added in 9.4, and some of these things are very small, and some of them are actually quite significant features that have occupied a significant amount of MQ development resource throughout the for a good period of time. So there's lots and lots of good function, and I think the general expectation is that regardless of which platform you're on, regardless of which APIs you're using, regardless of whether you're containers or using VMs or whatever, then there's something here for you in 9.4. And we're not going to get through all of this today because that's, you know, there's enough stuff here to talk through in detail for probably about 3 or 4 hours. But we are going to kind of summarize the highlights. And then this slide shows you what we've got in 9.4.1 and 9.4.2, and you can kind of see that 9.4.1 is relatively light, and this is typically because we put all of our effort into getting the new function out in the long-term support release, and then some things either which didn't quite make it, unfortunately, going to the next CD release, or some things just, you know, were never planned for that long-term support release. But typically, you know, even though function isn't in an LTS release, that doesn't mean you can't adopt it either in your clients or your queue managers. And we are seeing more and more customers actually adopting the CD releases so they can take advantage of some of this capability. And typically that's easier if it's a client specific change. So I'd highlight the CCDT support for HTTPS, which Ant is going to cover in a bit. You know, that's something that you don't need a queue manager update for. You can instead just update your client, and then, you know, you've got advantage of a great bit of technology as well. And then 9.4.2 is a bit more meaty. There's quite a good chunk of stuff in there, including kind of native HA CRR, cross-region replication, which is definitely a very big thing. And Ant is going to touch on that towards the middle of this presentation. So starting off with observability. So here you can see the big triangle, or the little triangle, in the top right hand side, and I'm also giving a plug there for the fact that this is we've got a whole session on observability, which is tomorrow, M24. So do go and see that if what I'm going to talk about in a minute is of interest to you. So there's kind of this is definitely a thing that has been building up. So MQ's always been observable. We've always had lots of data, metrics, statistics, accounting data that you can kind of get out of the queue manager and do something with. And that's been something that's been part of the core product for decades. But we are seeing an increasing trend for customers to want to understand in detail the whole of their infrastructure, and the challenge with doing that understanding is often there's quite a lot of different tools. So, you know, you might need to use one tool for one product, another tool for a different product, and then you're starting to get to a world where you've got lots of different panes of glass, and trying to figure out what's being used where gets quite hard. And of course, then you're also often dealing with different SMEs. So someone knows how to deal with the MQ stuff, someone else knows how to deal with the DB2 stuff, and that sort of thing. But what we're seeing more often now is actually customers wanting to be able to have a single set of tools that they can use to understand what's going in their systems, regardless of exactly where their systems are. And this is where open telemetry comes in. So this is a relatively recent, like it's been around for a few years now, but still relatively recent idea in that it's an open source observability framework and set of tools designed for understanding your infrastructure, whether it's messaging middleware, databases, machines. You know, it kind of works at every level, and it's kind of split up into 3 different pillars, or 3 different sets of data that it collects. It provides support for collecting trace, metrics, and log data. So log data is basically what I would traditionally think of as a log. So things like the MQ error log on distributed, or a job log on ZOS. Metrics is basically what it sounds like. It's all statistics and information about what a system is doing in terms of pure numbers. But trace is quite an interesting one. This is more to do with tracking the flow of an application as it moves through its different components. So if you think about a typical application, it's normally not just using a single bit of a system. You know, it might start off as the diagram down the bottom left it shows, it might start off with an HTTP request coming into something like Web Serial Liberty Profile, and Web Serial Liberty Profile does a bit of messaging to go and interact with a database. And when you've got application patterns like that, it can be actually quite hard to understand where things might go wrong. So, you know, at the end user level, you'll see something go slow. To try and understand where that slowness happens is quite tricky when you've got a toolkit that consists of lots of different isolated siloed tools. And the idea of open telemetry is you try and get rid of those silos so that you kind of have a single place you can go and look for all of your different bits of data. And so trace is an area we've been particularly focusing on recently. And the idea here, like I said, is to allow you to track your application as it moves through your system. And in order to do that, you need each bit of the system to be able to take part in that trace and basically emit something saying, you know, I was just called and I did this for this particular user. So in terms of MQ, that consists of emitting spans, which are basically the units of a trace saying, you know, a message was put to this queue at this time, and then a message was got from this queue at some other time. And by using those bits of the trace, those spans, you can kind of build up a bigger picture of what's happening and focus in on any anomalies. Like, you know, if someone says, well, I haven't received a request, and you see a put span but you don't see a get span, it might just be the case that something's happened with the getting application, or maybe the message is expired or something like that. And that's kind of the idea of open telemetry. And the main benefit is it's an open standard, so the data that you use with open telemetry isn't a proprietary format, it's an open standard, so you can therefore choose which backend tools you use it with. So in terms of what this means for MQ, it's basically a function we have on MQ on distributed, provided by Instana, which you get entitlement for with the core queue manager. And it's basically in the form of a message exit. So you can install this exit in your distributed MQ environment and then configure it to emit traces as messages move through MQ. And then you can point that trace data either to Instana if that's what you want to use, but you can also use it with anything else that supports the OTLP, which is an open telemetry format. So you push it to Jaeger or Prometheus or any other tooling you happen to use, and it just provides a very nice way of getting MQ integrated in with anything else that's trying to emit a trace. So like I say, this is something that will be covered in more detail tomorrow. It is very easy to get hold of and try, so I'd recommend you give it a go and then, you know, see how it works for you. So that's one aspect of observability. The next aspect I wanted to talk about was the MQ console. So if you recall, the MQ console is a web UI for interacting with MQ. It's a bit like MQ Explorer, but web-based, which obviously brings you benefits in that you can just install it in one place and then point all of your admins or your developers at it, and you don't have to set up MQ Explorer on different environments. And so we've been quite focused on MQ console development for about the last 8 years. There's been lots of iterative function building up over time, and what we wanted to do was to try and get away from MQ Explorer's approach of just having lists of things. You know, if you go on MQ Explorer, there's a list of queues, there's a list of channels, there's a list of queue managers, and we kind of wanted to add a bit more observability capability into the console itself, and that's been a big focus in the 9.4 timeframe. And the aim here isn't to replace traditional observability tools. This is more like giving you a real-time observability environment, so you can see what's happened to my queue manager recently. It doesn't give you information about what happened to my queue manager 5 days ago, but it does do a good job of showing you what your queue manager has been doing in the last half an hour or last hour. And the idea is that when you log into the console, click on the queue manager you're interested in, you immediately get a dashboard which kind of summarizes all of the work going through that queue manager. So you can immediately have a quick look and get an understanding of whether things are good or bad. And then if you want to dig deeper, then you can start to get back to those lists of queues, channels and all the rest of it. So just to talk through what's here, we start off at the top with information about how the system, or how much capacity there is on the system the MQ Explorer is running on. Sorry, the MQ console is running on. That's a bit of a slip. So you can see whether there's actually capacity in the environment that your queue managers are running on. And if you're short on storage, that's obviously a bit of a thing to worry about. Same sort of thing with CPU and memory. You can also get a good feeling that the situation is normal in terms of the amount of work moving through your system. So you can count the number of messages moving through your queue manager over a recent time period. Again, you can then see connected applications, whether they're locally connected or connecting as a client, and check whether that's the right sort of number. Obviously, if you log in and you see there's no applications, that should probably start to ring alarm bells. And a similar sort of thing applies to queue managers as well. So yeah, so applies to queue managers as well. And then the last bit I'll pull out is just, a full queue is normally a bad sign, so we highlight that as well if you've got any full queues. And then the nice thing about the console is because it's all just a web UI, everything's hyperlinked. So in the case of that test 1 2 3 4 queue, you just click on that and then you can go to the queue and see what's going on and start to understand whether there's any applications that should have been using that queue have stopped. And that will start to give you that clue as to what's actually going on. So that's kind of like the high level bit. We also provide the ability to drill down further in terms of what things are connected to the queue manager. And again, we've got a high level dashboard which you can then drill down in from. And here there's kind of two bits. Again, it's the queue manager to queue manager connectivity. So you can see whether it's your queue manager is part of a cluster. Is there anything problematic in terms of what's going on in that cluster? Are there any transmission queues which are not being serviced? Things like that. And you can also get a view of what's going on the application side of things as well. So, what version of clients are connected in? Are they running with TLS? Are they running back level? All those sorts of things, which is just, again, it's just a good idea of getting a nice warm fuzzy feeling about how your environment is running. And then, this kind of this slide shows a level even below that of connected applications. And so the idea here is this is designed to show you which applications are connected in and also group them together in a nice way. So since we've added support for uniform clusters, which means that applications aren't separate things, they're all they're things that, more obviously things that collaborate and work together. This page gives you a nice view of collaborating applications and how many instances of a specific named application you have working on your queue manager. So again, you can kind of get an understanding of whether that's what's normal for your environment or not. But like I say, the idea here is that the console does a bit more of the heavy lifting in terms of making this stuff easier to understand than the MQ Explorer does. So the next chunk of stuff we're going to talk about is security. So I think this is now where we smoothly link over to you, Ant.
Seamless. Right, so as you'll see on the page in front of you, there is a deeper dive session on security later in the week, named Acronym Soup, which is pretty fitting given the kind of topics we're talking about, and that's particularly going to go into the first item I'm going to talk about now. If you move on to the next page, token-based authentication. So this is one of the big new additions in MQ9.4, and we've also been adding some bits and pieces to that since, which I'll talk about more in a moment. Token-based authentication, for those who aren't aware, this is the idea that rather than authenticating with a service directly, in this case MQ, you're not going to provide a username and a password to MQ and expect us to validate that and say, okay, yes, now I know who you are. I've looked that up in some local database. You're going to hand that off to a third-party service, and that's going to perform whatever kind of authentication is required, and that's going to give you a short-lived token that can then be presented to, in this case, MQ, to prove your identity for the session that you're trying to create. So in MQ terms, what this means is that you at MQ Connect time, rather than providing a username and a password to the queue manager, you're going to provide this token, which you've acquired from a third-party service. That can be all kind of things. That could be an IAM in your SaaS environment. That could be Keycloak is one open source service that we do a lot of our internal testing with, and many other providers out there. You authenticate with them. That might involve two-factor authentication. That might involve certificates. That might involve a username and password managed with that service. MQ doesn't care at this point. You're just going to get back a token that can be given to MQ. This is a well-defined format, JWT, and that is sufficient for MQ to cryptographically validate that you are who you say you are. We trust the signer of that token, and for this MQ connection, we're going to allow you to act as that identity. There's lots of reasons you might want to do that. The most obvious are centralizing things. So in many cases, enterprises will already have some kind of authorization server there, the kind of thing that's providing your user directory for the business as a whole already, and you can integrate your MQ authentication into that through this kind of mechanism. It's often seen as more secure than a username and password approach, for example, because you no longer need to expose those credentials to MQ or the MQ administrators. You're purely managing all of that at the authorization server, one secure place where you've hopefully got everything nicely locked down, and then these tokens are typically valid for seconds or minutes for creating that connection to MQ. If a token's compromised, if somebody gets hold of that shouldn't have, if they try and connect to MQ with that 10 minutes later, they're not going to get in anyway. So lots of good reasons for doing this. The acronym soup that was referred to on the slide before, there are many standards in this area. MQ has effectively implemented some of those standards, so we're using standard format tokens. We're not going as far at this point as a full implementation of things like OIDC, which you might have come across, because that's generally more suited to sort of web applications than back-end applications of the kind that are connecting into MQ. But we may carry on down that road with future updates in this area. I don't think you'll ever see connecting to MQ looking quite like connecting to a web server, but there are other bits of these standards that may be applicable here. One in particular that I want to pull out is JWKS. So when we first introduced token authentication in 9.3 something, 5 I think, we required completely manual configuration of all the keys, certificates that are used for doing the validation of tokens. So although at runtime, when a token is presented to MQ, we don't have to talk to the authorization server, we're using pre-defined certificates and keys to check that a token proves who you are who you say you are. There was still quite a bit of setup required on the queue manager side in advance to make sure that all the keys are in the right places so that we can validate validate tokens when they're presented. JWKS is one standard in this area which makes things much simpler to configure. So rather than going into your queue manager and configuring all your key stores and keys up front for the authorization service, JWKS allows MQ to go and fetch those dynamically. So it will in fact fetch them up front so that it has a store if the service is down temporarily, but it will also, if it sees a new key signed by a certificate it's not aware of, it will go and see whether that has been updated on the server. Makes it far easier to manage, easier to update keys over time, maintain that kind of thing. So if you did take a look at JWT when it very first appeared, I would strongly encourage you to look at the updates in JWKS if you're looking at deploying that. If we can move on. Another update in the security area is to be aware of the move towards PKCS 12 key stores. So there's a number of changes happening in this area to be aware of. As you're probably aware, MQ has traditionally used CMS key stores. That's been managed through the GSKit layer in MQ. In a number of places, we're seeing a trend towards PKCS 12. So the JVMs that are supported with MQ for the Java components are typically moving to using PKS 12, P12 key stores rather than CMS. The components of MQ which prerequisite those JVMs, therefore, are moving to using or requiring a P12 key store rather than CMS. Other parts of MQ, you now have the option at least. So it's up to you, but the direction of travel is towards P12 as a standard, and most of the tooling and things around that people have prefer to work with a PKSTS 12 key store. So I think that's where we're seeing things going. One consequence of that, and this is the right-hand side of this page, if you like, is the format doesn't innately lend itself to stash files for passwords in the same way that's traditionally been managed. So we've integrated options for managing the security of that key store. So the queue manager kind of integrates directly this idea of the keyring password. The clients, we provide tools that you can do that for directly. So there's various different tools for the different environments, all of which allow you to give some way to safely encrypt the password that you're using to open that key store when you need to get at the certificates. If we move on. Thank you. Matt mentioned this earlier. It seems like a small update in one of the recent CD releases. I think it's a very important one. So this was 9.4.1. So the first CD release in the 9.4 LTS. We've had the capability for a long time in MQ clients to fetch channel definitions, so client channel definition table, CCDTs, from a central server, which is incredibly useful. It gives you a way of doing centralized configuration so that you don't have to push files out to each of your clients. In practice, this was very limited from your MQI clients because the HTTP support for fetching these didn't include HTTPS security. So that was obviously a significant gap. It meant in practice, until now, it's been more common to share CCDTs either by doing some kind of upfront push scripting around that, or mounting a shared file system, or using a config map if you're in a container environment. As this has been becoming more and more important, as people are using things like uniform clusters, since we made available JSON CCDTs, and that's becoming a more common way to want to create and centrally host these things, we have now addressed that limitation. So since 9.4.1, you can now configure a key store on your client side to fetch the CCDTs securely from a web server and ensure that you've not, which is obviously very important because you want to ensure that you really are connecting to who you think you're connecting to, and so on. And as Matt said, important to remember that because this is a client-side change only, you can potentially pick this up and roll this out for your applications without moving the queue manager up to the latest CD release. If we can move on. A couple of other things to mention while we're on the security topics. So for those of you running MQ in containers, a common requirement for particular environments is to allow the container to itself be mounted as a read-only root file system, so that it can't be corrupted, modified by bad actors, no kind of rights to any of the files in the container itself at runtime. That capability is now available, but not enabled by default. That does need to be turned on manually on a per container, per queue manager basis. And it comes with some additional configuration options that are needed around that, about the permissions to the scratch and temporary volumes that are going to be used for writing files when you're running from that container. The final thing I want to talk about while we're on the security topics is almost an anti-security one, if you like. Skip TLS certificate validation was a very popular request from customers. We initially internally were discussing calling this insecure mode, but that got vetoed. But it really is worth highlighting that this is about making things less secure, if anything. Why would you want to do that? It's a common ask for test environments, places where you want to prove that your client can fundamentally work with TLS, but you don't want the full cost of maintaining all your certificates and so on. So this mode means that no validation on a certificate is actually done. So although the connection will be secured, will be encrypted, you can't really rely on that, because you could be being attacked by some kind of man in the middle, purely for non-production use, quick start test environments. As I say, remember that it is not fundamentally a secure option, but it was something that we were seeing a lot of requests for, so that's been added. If we can move on. So the next area I'm going to talk about, and again, there's a deep dive session on this that will go much further, particularly on the container side of things. Resilience and scalability topics tomorrow morning. John Rumsey and Ian Edwards, I think, are running through that. If we move into the actual content. So if you've been following what's new in MQ over the last few years, you almost certainly already come across native high availability, native HA for MQ running in container environments. Initially, this was limited to CP4I. It's since been extended to wider use of the container within OpenShift and Kubernetes environments. What native HA gives you is a very seamless, built into MQ way of managing your HA failover between MQ nodes running in containers in one of these environments. All of the message data replication happens purely at the MQ level, so you don't need to configure any kind of external highly available storage solution or anything underpinning this. And then we use a quorum model between the 3 node HA group to ensure that only one node is active at one time, 100% synchronous replication between the nodes, no message data loss, all your transactional state and ordering and so on retained if there is a failover. That I think became initially available in 9.3, but as I say, there's been a lot of updates, including extending the operating environments we support that in. In the 9.4 LTS, some of the things to highlight, smarter media imaging. So this is updates to the way in which the core queue manager allows you to manage your logging and taking media images, snapshots of the state of the queue manager, which reduces the network load, reduces the costs of actually managing these multiple nodes and failing over between them. We've made the recovery, if you do have damaged objects, because we're replicating the logs and not the queue file data when you run in this environment. We can sometimes need to recover objects that can actually be safely done automatically. So wherever that's possible, that's now a job taken away from the administrator. And one other thing to mention is the LZ4 compression algorithm, which can greatly increase the performance of replication in some scenarios. So if that connection between your nodes, where MQ is replicating all of the queue manager log data between the containers, use of LZ4 on that replication link can really improve your performance. Can move on to the next slide. Thanks, Matt. So the big new news, and this is coming right up to date, 9.4.2. You'll see a lot more about this in the session tomorrow. Native HA up until now has been local, sort of within data center or perhaps within neighboring data centers, but local cluster, single Kubernetes cluster, synchronous replication, very similar to RDQM HA, if you're familiar with that in the Linux environments. With 9.4.2, we've now added an asynchronous replication solution to that, conceptually again similar to the RDQM DR solution, if you're familiar with that. And this allows you to replicate the state from one cluster to a geographically remote cluster or a cluster with higher latency network links. 3-node HA in one cluster, 3-node HA in another cluster, and asynchronous replication between those. For planned switchover, that means that you can safely QS the load in one and bring it up in the other with absolutely no message loss, and a close to zero loss in the case of an unplanned failover scenario, so a disaster recovery, because these are constantly being asynchronously replicated. If there is an unexpected all nodes in lost in cluster A, you can failover to cluster B with very little data loss, just the the currently in flight window of data at that time. So yeah, John, Ian will be talking a lot more about that tomorrow. Sorry, Matt, go ahead.
Oh, I was trying to predict and I failed. Sorry.
I mentioned it in passing on the other side. The other thing to do is to say is to mention that the LZ4 compression added for the HA replication is also now available for your queue manager channels. So when choosing compression algorithm for a channel with the comp message, you now have two new options, LZ4 fast, LZ4 high, which again can give more options, more choice between prioritizing speed, prioritizing the minimal amount of data on the wire. Moving on, thank you. The last section I was going to talk about flows on quite nicely because again we'll be talking about some of the HA options in a moment. The MQ appliance has had numerous updates over the last couple of years. One of them, some of you may know me from a former life. About 10 years ago I was the lead architect on the MQ appliance when we launched it. I think the number one requirement we had at the time and for many years since was for this feature. So I'm very pleased that the team have finally been able to deliver that. If you're familiar with the MQ appliance, the SSH interface to the appliance has always been a little bit idiosyncratic compared to some other platforms due to the way the underlying hardware manages the remote sessions into the box. You've had to effectively interactively enter usernames and passwords. You haven't been able to use things like standard certificate-based authentication to come in on the command line appliance and things. That's now addressed, so you can now, through the same interfaces, through the RBM, the role-based management interface of the appliance, configure it to allow you to just seamlessly integrate with a SSH certificate, authorize access, revoke access, all the things you would expect using certificate-based security for your SSH clients. And in fact, it will integrate with other, if you're using SSH clients which expect to provide a username and password as part of the initial connection, that can now work in a way that it didn't previously as well. So it doesn't need to be an interactive sign-in process. Coming back to what we spoke about a moment ago, so a very similar story for the HA to HA replication in appliances. I did a double take actually when I looked at this slide, and I thought, does this really belong in our What's New deck? And I had to be reminded that yes, we're still talking about the 9.4 LTS release. So when you're working on the bleeding edge CD release, it's easy to forget how long things have been in the product. This went into a 9.3 CD, so became available in 9.4 LTS. A very similar story for HA replication between local nodes, DR replication to remote nodes, remote data centers, asynchronous replication between those two groups, but full synchronous failover between the local nodes in either group. Move on to the next slide for that. This was another of the most frequently requested items, I think, on the appliance to-do list for a number of years. If you're familiar with the appliance, you'll be aware that it has a certain amount of separation between each queue manager, so you allocate the storage volumes and so on for each queue manager running on a given appliance. But of course, like any other environment, MQ is very sensitive to that storage becoming full. If you have very deep queues, if you have applications not draining their queues and so on, you can fill up that storage, and that can be a critical thing to be aware of. And although there have been solutions, and I think we had a sort of tech note and support pack and things of how you could configure some alerts and some polling around that, really we wanted something that was more integrated into the alert system on the appliance. So now, like any other log event on the system, you can configure log events to give you alerts when queue managers are reaching certain thresholds or nearing full at escalating levels of severity. So you can have an info, as shown in the example here, you might get an informational level alert that you're running at a nice low level of storage. You might get a warning when things start to fill up, and you can promote those all through the usual system, all integrated with the various log targets that you can configure on the appliance. I think this is the final slide I've got here on the appliance. So another feature to come along recently is the secure backup. So this is something that's probably primarily been requested by customers who use both the data power appliances and the MQ appliance. The MQ appliance for a number of years has provided backup facilities for your queue manager data. So you've been able to export an entire queue manager, all of its data, all of its logs into a nice tarball, extract that off, play it back onto the same appliance or onto a different appliance. But backup of the appliance configuration itself, the kind of system-wide meta stuff, if you like, has been a bit more of a manual process. So you could export the configuration scripts and those kinds of things, but there wasn't a one-shot, just give me a backup of everything, including all of the security key stores, certificates, things like that. Data Power has a functionality called secure backup, which does that, give me a one-shot snapshot of the entire appliance configuration, and we've now exposed equivalent capability for the MQ appliance based on the same kind of underlying technology. So that does include all of your system settings, all of your local user configuration, all of your system certificates. It doesn't include the actual queue manager data, which you can still export in the same way you've always been able to.
Okay.
Was there a question?
There was one about event messages for such things, which I think is probably, that must be to do with the file system full topic.
I wouldn't entirely rule it out, but I think it's probably unlikely, as these are appliance specific alerts, if you like. They kind of integrate more logically with that appliance level system monitoring targets and log targets. As with anything else, we would take an idea on that and have to see how that got voted for, where it came in the priorities.
Yeah, okay. So just for people asking questions, it's worth bearing in mind there's a lag between us speaking and being able to see your questions. So if we seem slightly surprised or confused, that's that is why. Okay, anything else you wanted to say there, Ant?
No, thank you. Back over to you.
Cool, thank you. Okay, so I think I've got 3 remaining topics and 19 minutes to do them, so let's see how we get on. So I'm going to start off by talking about a few enhancements in the administration and application development space. And now a number of these around our web support. So obviously I've talked about the MQ console already and said that's been something we've been evolving for the last 8 or so years. Once we'd done the console, we started looking at what else could we use this web, the Liberty app server we'd kind of embedded in the product. And so we started adding REST APIs, one for administration, one for MFT, and then we also added a messaging REST API. And this is something which we actually got asked very early on for, but it's taken a little while for customers to start wanting to use it. So we're now seeing quite a few customers have one the other day saying, can we use the messaging API just to do a little bit of messaging? And I think that's the right sort of approach, because REST is a powerful paradigm, but it's not the same as asynchronous messaging. And in this environment, we're kind of trying to merge the two worlds. So if you do want to interact with an MQQ, send messages in a fire and forget style from an environment where there isn't a full MQ client, then the REST messaging API is really good for that. It allows you to send messages, destructively get messages or browse them. But it's just worth bearing in mind, it's not a full feature API. It doesn't have all of the nice transactional integration that you get with our traditional clients, but it, like I say, is still very useful. So an area we've enhanced is the ability to have a centralized web server, which you can then use to front REST requests to send and receive messages to remote queue managers. So in the early days of all of our APIs for REST and for the console, everything was local. So if you had the web server, it could interact with local queue managers running on the same environment. We've been gradually removing that restriction. So the MQ console, I think in the 9.2 star timeframe, had the ability for remote administration, and we've now added that for the messaging API as well. What we haven't done is added it to the administrative API yet, but we will hopefully at some point. So kind of building on top of that, we've also added a standalone web server. So quite a common request for us was to how do I make my web server, which is currently co-located with my queue managers, highly available? And that's quite tricky when you've got this tight coupling between an MQ installation on distributed and a single web server that serves it. So what we've done is basically have the ability to split out the web server and download that and install it on Linux environments without a local queue manager. And once you've got that local copy of a web server, it starts to give you the ability to create multiple copies of it on different Linux environments, and then you can use a load balancer in front of those instances of the console to spread work amongst the various backends. And so that gives you both high availability of the REST API or the console, as well as scalability support as well. And the other particularly nice point I think here is it decouples it from an MQ release. So the console, as hopefully you saw earlier, is something we've been updating basically every single CD release for the last four major LTS cycles. So we're regularly updating new bits of functionality to kind of get parity and then start to exceed what you can get with the MQ Explorer. But of course, you don't want to be updating your queue managers quite as rapidly as that. So by having a standalone web server which contains a bleeding edge console, you can install that on Linux and then connect it to your LTS queue managers, whether they're on ZOS, Windows, Linux, AIX, or IBM I, or even the appliance. So you can it gives you the ability to keep cutting edge on the console, which is, I think, definitely the best place to be because we're putting so much new function there. But then you can connect it into your 9.4, 9.3 queue managers and just manage them from all one place. So this is I think, quite a key thing. Also in 9.4, there's been a number of little things, and when I say little things, some of these things have actually been quite big. So cap expiry is something that we've had in sort of, I'll call it advanced beta form for a long time. So it's possible to set an expiry cap on all of your queues and topics with MQ since the version 8 timeframe, but it was done via the custom attribute. So that is now a core first class attribute on queues and topics on all platforms. Sounds quite small, actually quite a big bit of work, but we've also been focusing on various things, just making it easier to use MQ and get access to it when you're doing your development. So, non-production entitlement, just reducing the cost of using MQ if the MQ for developers free license isn't appropriate. We also see more and more of our customers, and in fact most of MQ development, using Mac OS. So it's now easier to spin up a queue manager on Apple without having to use an emulation layer. And then of course we've just been keeping cadence with support for things like various compilers, versions of Java, and also catching up on things like modularization, that's quite hard to say, in the JMS/Jakarta area, which is a question we were increasingly getting customers asking for. So moving on, actually I think I've got 4 topics rather than 3, so I might be a little bit tight. Onto the cloud. Okay, so obviously the cloud isn't a new thing, but what it does take a little while for customers who are mainly focused on prem to adopt it. And if we look across the set of IBM customers, MQ customers, some of them haven't really started this journey, some of them have completed it, and quite a lot of them are in the middle, and some of them starting that journey by taking their existing on-prem environments and just lifting and shifting them in the cloud. So if they're running VM on on-prem, they'll run VM in the cloud, and then later on they might start modernizing for things like containers. But what we've been seeing is more customers actually wanting to have a messaging as a service style model. So rather than having to worry about installing a version of MQ, patching it, securing, worrying about security maintenance and spinning up the hardware and virtualization layers, instead we're seeing customers wanting just to be able to go into their cloud of choice, click on the t-shirt size box saying, give me an MQ queue manager that's capable of doing this much throughput, and then having that provisioned and managed for them. And then the only thing they need to worry about is the queues, topics, and other messaging resources they need. So this is what MQ as a service does. It's something we've had for actually quite a long time. I can't quite remember the time frame, but I think it's like a good 5 or so years that we've had this. And as with everything, we've evolved the story. So on the right hand side, there's kind of 4 different layers of capability, if you like, and the light, standard, and standard subscription are kind of is the function we've had for most of that 5-year time frame. And it gives you a good level of capability, the ability to provision the queue manager of different sizes and then do work with it. But as more and more customers have been interested in this space, we've seen that there's extra capabilities which we need to add, and these are in the form of the reserved instance, which is something that we announced in November last year, and then they became generally available in December. And so I'll just quickly summarize the set of capabilities here. So it is a reserved instance, which means it's single tenant, which obviously has a whole load of benefits in terms of expected performance capabilities and reduced chances of security breaches. It takes advantage of the native HA capability that Ant managed. So here's an example of IBM eating its own dinner, I guess, and it also includes an automation API. So the other capabilities, the other MQ as a service levels that we've supported until now, you actually have to go and manually request a queue manager, and that's done via a UI. Obviously, that's fine up to a certain level, but when you want to start scaling out and automating your deployment of queue managers and spinning them up and down, you need an API to do that. So we've also got that in there as well. A big thing was support for private endpoints, so the ability to connect between MQ as a service in the cloud and back on-prem via VPC. So that was definitely a real big tick point. And then the last bit I'll mention is Terraform support, just to make it easy to go and standardize your deployment of your queue managers and get a standard shape of the MQ environment you want. But of course, not everyone wants to use MQ as a service, although, like I say, increasing numbers do. So we've added enhancements also just on MQ in a cloud in general. So we're increasingly seeing customers having their budget being part of their cloud budget, wanting to spend that in MQ, and that can be a friction point. So we've kind of removed that friction, so you can now get hold of MQ in advanced. So IBM MQ or MQ Advanced licenses either via AWS or Azure. There's nothing more to it than that. It just means you can use your cloud budget rather than maybe your on-prem budget. And of course, when you are in the cloud, we want it to be easy for you to build out a best of breed environment for that cloud. So in the case of AWS, we've got a partner solution that makes it very easy with a one-click deploy to go and build up a native HA environment on EKS, and there's a link down the bottom to show you where that is, and that's something that's moved. So if you had that link from before and you can't find it, the latest link is down the bottom. So moving on to ZOS, I've got 8 minutes, so that's going to be interesting. So I'll just kind of fly through some of this. We're continuing to invest in keeping parity with the ZOS Queue Manager and the rest of the ZOS platform. So a good example of this was support for Z Hyperlink. So if you recall, a couple of LTS releases ago, I think 9.2, we added support for Z Hyperwrite with the MQ logger task, which basically makes writing to the MQ log faster in a mirrored disk environment. For 9.4, we built on top of that with support for Z Hyperlink, and the idea here is that you have your mainframe relatively close to the disks, and you have a dedicated super fast cable that goes between your Z box and your IBM disks, and that link is sufficiently direct and sufficiently fast that the normal asynchronous IO mode that the MQ logger task uses isn't necessary. You can basically write synchronously to the disk cache and to the disk on the DS8Ks, and what that means is the logger task can go faster. So in an environment where you might be log constrained because you're doing a lot of persistent messaging, this really speeds things up. And as an example down the bottom, we saw in our environment a 3.5 times reduction in terms of transactional elapsed time for putting, committing and getting committing. So your mileage might vary, but we've seen some really good numbers, and this is not with the latest disks. The latest DS8K have much faster Z hyperlink, which you'll automatically get benefits from with MQ. A very big thing for us for the 9.4 timeframe was 64-bit channel initiator support. So until now, the Chinit has largely been a 31-bit address space, which means it's quite constrained in terms of memory. And if you've got lots of applications connecting in and sending large messages, it could be quite tricky to get too many of those messages in memory at the same time. A 10 megabyte message being sent by a client into ZOS needs to be built back up into a 10 megabyte chunk of storage in the Chinit, and eventually you'll start to hit the pinch point in terms of the number of those messages you can build up. But that's no longer the case with 9.4. Those messages are no longer below the bar, they're above the bar, which means they're in 64-bit storage, so lots and lots of space, and that's no longer a constraint point. And this is a good example of where we had customers picking up CD releases on ZOS because they were so interested in it. Monitoring has been a topic that I've talked about for quite a long time now in the 9.2, 9.3 and now 9.4 timeframes. It's worth bearing in mind that we kind of finished this journey, so we now have very in-depth per queue statistics that give you about 60 different metrics, which you can look at on a per queue basis. And the idea here is you can just collect those metrics and look at them yourself, or you can feed them into tooling like IZO LDA or Megamon for it to go and point out interesting things for you. So kind of back to that observability side of things. And then the last bit, which I'm going to fly through quite quick, is just saying that I've talked about the MQ console quite a lot. Until recently, there was no real ZOS specific functionality in there, which is a bit of a barrier to entry for ZOS customers, and we've been adding that. So we've now got support for buffer pools, page sets, coupling facilities, and SMDS as well. So worth bearing in mind that's there. And this is a good example of why it's worth taking the latest console, because 9.4.2 we added a whole chunk of new function there as well. So I've got about 4 more slides. I'll skip this one and hopefully that will be okay, because I did want to talk a little bit about insight into business events. Now, you have to go back into time for this one, but David Ware did a great presentation talking about MQ and Kafka, how are they different and why you should use them together. And we really do think that's the case. We see lots and lots of customers who already have MQ wanting to make use of Kafka, and actually often the data that you want to feed into Kafka for analytics purposes is already in MQ, and so it makes sense to wire the two things together, push a copy of the data from MQ into Kafka, and then do something smart with that platform. So this is something that is basically a daily conversation for us. We're talking to all of our MQ customers, or in fact they're talking to us saying, we have MQ, we want to start using that data in Kafka, how do we go about it? And literally it is a daily conversation. And the patterns we tend to see there are either applications being written to push new sets of data into Kafka, in which case it's just as simple as putting it to a queue, but also streaming queues, which we added in the 9.3 timeframe, is basically a great way of, if your existing data is moving through MQ, taking a copy of it without your applications having to care, and then you can push it into Kafka. And I'll skip that one. And the technology that makes this possible is basically Kafka connectors. And these are basically a standard piece of function for Kafka that allows you to take data from elsewhere and push it into Kafka, or take data from Kafka and push it into your external systems. And there's about 100 different connectors, but the important ones obviously are the MQ ones. And so these are connectors that we provide, IBM provides, and if you've got entitlement to either MQ Advanced or Cloud Platform Integration or to event streams, then we will support you using these connectors between your MQ infrastructure, whether that's on ZOS or distributed or wherever in the cloud, and then push it out to your Kafka vendor of choice. Okay, so this is just really worth bearing in mind that there's a lot of value in getting hold of these connectors, and they're really easy to get started with, but you need the appropriate entitlements. And I think that is that is all we've got to talk about. Sorry, the last few slides was a little bit rushed. I won't blame Ant for that. I'll blame me talking too long at the beginning. And I think Ray was just going to say a last few words before we close.
Absolutely. Thanks, Matt. Great job, guys. So we're getting ready to transition over to the last session of the day, which is office hours. Give you an opportunity to ask questions. All of our speakers from today will be on office hours, along with a couple of business partners. So it will go live at 1:30, or well, 1:30 my time, 30 minutes after. So in about 6 minutes. And please fill out the survey for this session, and we will see you in 6 minutes. Thanks, guys.